Every great story has a beginning, a journey filled with passion and a vision for change. Let's take a look at the incredible journey of Nalafem so far. It all started in October 2020 with the organization of 5 regional barazas consultations. These consultations paved the way for the co-creation of the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. In November 2020, during the high-level Intergenerational Dialogue, the manifesto was officially presented to the UN Women and the African Union.
Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. And with this submission, I submit the voices, the aspiration, and the hopes and the demands of young women on our beloved continent. And we share now the responsibility and accountability across generations to make sure these demands of Generation Equality Forum are taken into account and acted on.
Over the following months, Nalafem tirelessly worked to gather support. They collected over 10,000 signatures from over 105 countries, both online and offline. Nala Feminist Collective is a Pan-African group of women politicians and activists with a mission to bridge the gap between policy and implementation, intergovernmental and grassroots spaces, as well as generational gap. Their efforts bore fruit when 8 out of the 10 demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto were adopted into the UN Action Coalition's Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact from April to June 2021.
شغل حرية كرامة وطنية. Jobs, freedom, dignity. It has always been a revolution for economic justice led by women and young people.
On July 1st, 2021, Nalafem was officially launched at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, France. Since then, Nalafem has been leading the way, organizing 6 intergenerational dialogues for accountability in August 2021 and embarking on advocacy missions to several countries. In July 2022, the inaugural Nalafem Summit and Awards took place in Abuja, Nigeria, under the theme, I Am Nala. This landmark event brought together advocates, policymakers, and activists united in the fight against gender-based violence and for gender justice. During the summit, Nalafem also launched their book titled I Am Nala, which shares empowering stories and advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals, the demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, and African Union Agenda 2063. With the launch of the Nalafem 5-year strategy spanning from 2023 to 2027, Nalafem is committed to advocating for accountability, investing in the socio-economic power of African women and girls, and elevating young African women into politics. To make a difference, Nalafem has devised flagship projects such as the Nalafem Academy, Nalafem Index, Multi-Generational Dialogues for Accountability, Nalafem Fund, and the annual Nalafem Summit. Through these initiatives, Nalafem aims to impact the lives of 1 million women and girls by 2027, nurturing an ecosystem for feminist transformation and amplifying the voices of African women and girls through various mediums, including activism and digital creatives. Also, in November 2022, Nalafem made its mark at COP27 in Egypt. They organized roundtables, supported African climate activists, and led a delegation of 8 young women to the conference. These dedicated activists raised their voices for climate action, advocating for a sustainable future. Alongside these impactful initiatives, Nalafem launched an inspiring podcast series. The I Am Nala podcast amplifies the voices and stories of African women and girls, shedding light on their challenges, triumphs, and aspirations. Nalafem's journey has been marked by collaborations and partnerships with organizations and individuals committed to women's rights and gender equality. We extend our utmost gratitude to our partners for their support. But the journey is far from over. Nalafem invites you to join the cause, to be part of this great vision and mission to liberate the African women and girl. Together, we are all Nala.
Welcome everybody, and welcome to the Nalafem Accountability Series for the third episode, which is Decolonizing Funding for Accountability. My name is Sayeda Reem Hussain, Project Manager at Nalafem, and I will be your host. So we started this series in September to provide a platform to advance accountability conversations and bridge the gap between policy and implementation, making sure young feminists are at the forefront. At Nalafem, we are guided by the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 manifesto, where advocacy now is focused on supporting member states to implement this manifesto. Take a look at the demand. So to know more about Nalafem and our work, you can visit our website, nalafem.org. And to drive this conversation on accountability, please use the hashtag Nalafem Accountability and hashtag CSW68. For those watching on Zoom, welcome, and please feel free to share your comments and questions in the chat box as we go into the conversation. But before we begin, we would like to recognize all the humanitarian crises happening around the world, which find their root in colonialism and hold space for all the people involved in the colonial processes. We hold this space recognizing our common history and humanity. Thank you. With all the current conversations around decolonization and what it means, we are taking the time today to explore and demystify what it really means to be a decolonial Pan-African feminist, and particularly what this means in practical terms when it comes to funding, where it comes from, and the structures that govern it. To lead today's discussion, I welcome our panelists here with us, our Dr. Njoki Wamai, Assistant Professor of International Studies and Politics at the United States International University, Africa. Welcome, Dr. Wamai. And Rosebel Kagumire, who is Nalafem Council member as well as a feminist writer. We're really happy to have you here today, Rosebel. Welcome. As well as Leah Moss, Officer for Influencing at Mama Cash. So to start our discussion, and I know this is a very heavy discussion for a lot of people who are joining today in the room, just given everything that's happening around the world currently. But I'd like to invite you, Leah, to maybe speak to what are the current models of funding in developmental spaces for feminists, and how is specifically Mama Cash decolonizing this funding and funding structures?
Thanks, Sayeda. Hi, everyone. I'm Leah. I work at Mama Cash, as Sayeda just mentioned. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Mama Cash, it's an international women's fund that's based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And I'll talk a little bit more about our own funding practices and how we work in a moment. But I thought, considering the discussion is on decolonizing funding, it's kind of first important to acknowledge that the existing model of aid and philanthropy, which many of us work in, is rooted in kind of deeply patriarchal and colonial histories and legacies. And so we are working within that system. And money sits where it sits in certain institutions and in certain countries, not accidentally, but deliberately. And so we're always working with that kind of awareness. We know that these colonial legacies are present in kind of government and philanthropic funding in general, and that it results in largely people in the global north taking these funding decisions, deciding who the money goes to, how it goes, who it reaches, and what it's spent on. And many within this system are very focused on kind of upholding and maintaining the status quo around it. So when we think about like what a feminist and decolonial approach to funding looks like, I think this kind of forces us to first think about power. So how does it show up in the system? How is power showing up in our own institutions? And as funders, how are we actually disrupting and dismantling that power? And that takes many forms, but it kind of affects how we're thinking about power through our funding practices as a women's fund. In our advocacy work. So how are we talking about kind of decolonizing funding and feminist and decolonial approaches to funding with governments, with private philanthropy? And then also how are we thinking about this with our partners and how we work together with our partners, what that relationship actually looks like. And I think we at Mama Cash are focused on redistributing the money that's within aid and philanthropy and also within sharing power. But I'll come back to that in a moment. I just wanted to first talk about that. I think we acknowledge, and I definitely personally acknowledge, that decolonizing starts by recognizing our own role and the role of our institutions within this very kind of patriarchal system. And maybe it's helpful to also look a bit at what the kind of overall funding landscape looks like in terms of funding for women's rights organizations and feminist movements. So we're an organization that funds feminist movements and organizations working all across the world on different issues, but with the idea to really advance social justice. And when we look at actually where the overall funding goes to from both government and private foundations, very, very little money reaches feminist movements and organizations. And so when we speak of accountability, we hear a lot of commitments made when governments announce a feminist foreign policy or when governments commit to the Generation Equality Forum. And they talk about funding and supporting women's rights organizations, but when we look at the actual data, very little money actually reaches them. So of all the gender-focused aid within the international system, less than 2% of it actually reaches women's rights organizations. And I think what's even more important is that of that 2%, the majority of it stays within organizations based in the global north. So very, very little of that funding actually reaches women's rights organizations who are based in the countries in which they're working. Many of you have probably seen the data that came out in the Black Feminist Fund report, which looks at the money going to, for and against Black feminist movements. But that also paints a very bleak picture of kind of where the funding is actually going and how little of it reaches these organizations. And I think it said that less than 0.1% of all foundation funding globally actually reaches activism by Black women, girls, and trans people. So, I mean, some of these figures, it paints a depressing picture, but I think it's important to just be clear on where the money is actually going. And when we think about where this funding is going and how little of it's reaching women's rights organizations, it's also important to talk about what that funding actually looks like, because we try and really talk at Mama Cash about not just more funding, but better funding. And there's a reason that so many organizations are unable to access this funding. And that's because very colonial attitudes show up in actually the way this funding is given. And so if we look at the majority of funding, it's not core unrestricted funding that enables these groups to have their own priorities and develop their own strategies and actually take decisions on what they spend the money on. But the majority of that funding is projectized. So it's tied to a certain project, which means they have very little flexibility on how it's spent. These kind of colonial attitudes also show up in definitions from funders on what constitutes as evidence and impact and learning. It makes reporting very difficult, and it means they place very burdensome reporting requirements on organizations, which makes it very difficult for smaller organizations with small budgets to actually be able to absorb and report on this funding. It shows up in funding applications and procedures. I'm sure many of you have tried to access funding yourselves from different foundations, and it can be very, very difficult and burdensome, almost impossible. And so we know that so much of the funding that even supposedly is available ends up reinforcing very colonial patriarchal power structures, which are rooted in distrust and control, right? So this idea that you can't trust these groups to take their own decisions about what they should spend the money on, and that everything needs to be very much controlled. Based on ideas, I mean, we know colonial ideas around fraud, around lack of accountability, really an assumption that groups and activists around the world, particularly those based in the global south, can't be trusted on their own priorities. So what do we do at Mamakash? So we're an international women's fund, as I said. We've been around for 40 years. It's our 40-year anniversary this year. And we focus on providing multi-year core and unrestricted funding to feminist organizations around the world. And it's really important that that funding is long-term so that groups are able to set priorities and meet goals. We know that things can't be achieved within a short amount of time. And all of this funding is non-thematic. So we don't restrict it to like a certain project or like what, a certain area like sexual and reproductive health. We know that groups' priorities change and that they need this core and unrestricted funding to be able to do their work. We also have a participatory approach. So since 2021, we're a fully participatory grant maker. There are lots of other funds who followed this approach, like Frida, the Young Feminist Fund, the Red Umbrella Fund, which is a fund for sex workers. And it's really based on the premise that we can't be taking decisions on who receives that funding without the impact of the activists and groups who it's supposed to be reaching. And so we have participatory models for all of our 5 funds where decisions are taken together with and by the activists who are actually doing that work. And it's really trying to kind of move away from this idea that it should be those in the global north taking decisions on where and for whom the funding goes. And then just important to mention that our approach really, as a women's fund, and this is work that many other women's and feminist funds around the world do, is to try and reduce the very burdensome due diligence practices and reporting requirements from funders. So we as women's funds try and absorb as much of that as possible and pass on as little as we can to our partners, who we know are actually doing a lot of the very important work on the front lines and do not have the time to be kind of fulfilling all of those requirements. And it's really our role, and when I talked earlier about recognizing our power in the system, recognizing our role as a funder based in the global north and how we can kind of help and share power in that way. And then finally, I think in terms of decolonizing our approach, it's also focused on what we do internally, right? So we're very committed to like anti-racist processes internally, and it's a constant journey. How are we considering how racist and colonial legacies and attitudes show up in our relationships as between each other, as an institution, and in the way we work? So that's a constant journey. And then finally, I just want to talk about the work I do as Mamakash, which is externally focused. So I'm not making the grants, but I'm trying to influence other donors, particularly those in government, on how they can actually kind of decolonize their funding practices. So this ties a bit more with the theme on accountability. We're trying to hold those governments accountable to the commitments they have made through things like generation equality. And we really call on funders to not just invest more money in women's rights organizations, but as I said, make sure that that's better money. We recognize that the quality of funding is just as important as the quantity. We ask them to reassess their approach to risk and impact, which we know is so rooted in colonial attitudes. And we try and help them understand what this approach to risk that they have is based on. And so in a system that's already so controlled, we ask them to match the courage of the activists and the movements that they want to fund, who are already doing inherently risky work. And we kind of try and make the case to them that upholding the status quo by not funding these movements and supporting them is actually far riskier in the long term. So reframing those attitudes around risk and impact, and really looking at how you move resources is just as important as how much you move. So I'm going to finish there because I know there's 2 other great speakers. And just to say that we know that this work as well, and I really know that it's a kind of very small drop in the ocean of a much bigger, deeply flawed system, right? And we can kind of decolonize approaches to development, aid and philanthropy, while recognizing that we're in a much kind of bigger system of global capitalism where we see increased funding for militarism. So we have increased defense spending, very problematic trade policies, migration and climate. And we need to recognize that this is a very important but small part of the picture. So I think it's always be clear, you know, in calling out for policy coherence across and recognizing that decolonizing is a much grander approach than just development and philanthropy. But perhaps we can discuss that a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. And on that note, I'd like to turn to Dr. Wamai, you know, just recognizing, I think, what Leah said, and what we all know, that that decolonization is a process because it's a constant, you know, first recognition of the structures that are colonial, and then the dismantling of those structures, the reflection and dismantling of those structures. So I just want to ask you, Dr. Wamai, what does decolonization specifically mean practically for Pan-African feminists in their daily social justice work?
Thank you, Sida. I think I will start. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. So thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me first to be part of this great conversation with I Am Nala, as one of the people also who I am Nalafem. And I think it was very good to hear from Leah, who is, working in a funding organization with some of the practical things that funders can do. But I also thought maybe some of our colleagues around the table may not know decolonization also, and decoloniality has become a buzzword. I just needed, if you will allow me, Sarah, to just share like what it, first of all, what does it mean in terms of definition? And I wanted to first say that decolonization entails resisting and rejecting ways of being. So, and especially as Pan-African feminists, being is so important, being and becoming, anyway. And so the colonized or formerly colonized people, like many of us in the African continent, must recenter their own undermined but varied cultural resources, ways of being, and also their identity, and also development processes for us who are doing development work. So this implies that decisions on decolonizing ourselves or decolonizing development practices must be driven by those affected, by those communities at the local level. So it has to start from, say, if it's at the regional level in Africa, or also among everyday people at the community level. So that is what decolonization means. So it entails resisting and rejecting colonized ways of being and colonized ways of doing development. And then what is then decoloniality? Another term that is now being often used. So then decoloniality refers to the process of examining the matrix of power that emerged after colonization of the global south. And in this case, we're talking about Africa, in this context, by European states. So decoloniality is that process of examining the matrix of power, while decolonization is also about resisting and rejecting those colonial ways of being. So decoloniality then examines and decenters the enduring effects of coloniality that privileges then a Eurocentric or European conceptualization of everything. So whether it's about our own identity, about development, and modernity, especially that I'm going to be talking a lot about that as Pan-African feminists. What do we assume what is modern, what is to move, what is to be, modern, which excludes marginalized groups, including, of course, formerly colonized people. So we have, so decoloniality or coloniality privileges a Eurocentric conceptualization of being, of development, and of modernity, which often excludes marginalized groups, including African women, people with disability. And you can imagine the different intersectionalities of these different groups. So non-binary people, including formerly colonized people. So I think having examined that, it's very important to know, it's very important to mention, to understand what these terms mean. So as Pan-African feminists, going back to this question, how do we, live a decolonized life, or how do we decolonize? I think the first thing we need to do, and talk about three things. One is to decolonize ourselves. I think that's where the starting point is. How do we decolonize ourselves? That's maybe somebody is wondering, how do you decolonize yourself? So first of all, I think if you had in that definition of decoloniality, it's first acknowledging this, the history of how we have come to be, especially our identity. And we cannot totally decolonize ourselves, because we can't go maybe to the bush and start wearing skins. And I mean, of course, it would be really nice. I think I would love that, given the stress of everyday life. But you know, I mean, you can't do that given how many things you need to do. So anyway, so it's decolonizing ourselves is not just going back to the village or going back to indigenous ways of being. Of course, and also some of those indigenous ways of being, I think, are important in centering ourselves in our Africanness. And so by decolonizing ourselves, we decenter Eurocentric ways of being. So I think it's for each of us as individuals to first reflect, what Eurocentric ways of being do I embody? And some of them are good. Don't also feel like, oh my God, it's black and white. No. As much, I mean, look, we're talking through technology. We are all dressed in modern clothes or whatever. So of course, we cannot totally go back to that very essentialist way of being. We are really hybrid people, like Homi Baba has talked about. But it's about our ideology, So decentering Eurocentric ways of being in terms of how we think. What do we conceptualize as progress? And you had in that definition as modernity. What is to be modern? What is to be a modern African woman? Let's go back and start rethinking in our own communities. I can see Charlotte here. Like, what is modernity among the Luos in Kenya? What is Rosebell? Your people, I don't know, are they Nyanja? What is modernity among Western Uganda, where Rosebell comes from? And each of our communities, we were modern. I mean, as long as a community was existing and it had generations of people and moving and not getting extinct, it means they had a certain form of civilization to be able to move from one generation to another. And that civilization also entailed a certain modernity, because it means there was progress and they were progressing from one stage to another. That modernity, of course, it was not conceptualized on a European modernity. And European modernity, of course, comes from what we call the Enlightenment period, some time in history between, I think, 1650s to around 1800s. So it's a time in history for Europe that created their own ideas of the modern state. What is to be a modern state? How should a modern state function? What is development? Even this term development came from around that time. So all those are terms we carry every day and we assume they are neutral, but they are not. They come from a little province of the world called Europe. And there's a very good book, if you really want to read more, called Provincializing Europe by Dipesh Chakrabarty. And I think it's available freely on the internet. So we need to provincialize Europe to the province of the world it belongs. And once we do that, we are able to then start thinking, actually, these ideas that came from Europe are just provincial ideas in one corner of the world that became universal. Why did they become universal? Because of colonialism. And colonialism was able to spread ideas, and they made small ideas from a corner of the world to make them universal ideas. We did not have the same opportunity of colonizing others. So maybe even though we had ideas on what is, the state, progress, development, we were not able to have the same privilege anyway. So decolonizing ourselves is the start. And there are many resources as African women we can use. I don't know whether I can share a quick slide on some of the books if you're interested in seeing some of these books that you can read. So there is, as you can see there, Ngugi wa Thiong'o is always a good start. Ngugi wa Thiong'o talks about decolonizing the mind, and that's why I was saying that's a good place to start. Let's decolonize our minds. Samira Amin on Eurocentrism, who talks also about Europe and how that enduring effects of Europe's ideas and universalizing Europe's ideas. Edward Said on Orientalism, Kimberly Crenshaw, a feminist, on intersectionality, Walter Mignolo, I think he's from Latin America, on decoloniality, Sabelo Gasheni on decoloniality, development, and knowledge in Africa. And there is also Claude Ake, who also has talked about social science as imperialism. And our African feminists on decolonial feminism, our Ugandan feminist scholar, this is, oh my God, the name has gone.
Tamale.
Okay. Yes, Sylvia Tamale. So, and that Sylvia Tamale's book is freely available. So if you just Google Sylvia Tamale, decolonial, it's Afrofem. Her book is called Afro Decolonization and Afrofeminism. It's also a good start. So I think I just wanted to share that so that we can, just in case you're thinking how or where would I start with this decolonial. So decolonizing the self is so important, because if and how we can decolonize ourselves is through reading, is through sharing. But now going to the practical after reading these things, then you don't have to read all those books there. You can also just get online. There are so many spaces. If you just Google decolonial people, there are so many webinars right now with people talking about that. What does it also mean as an African feminist, as a Pan-African feminist, is also the priorities you make in terms of like if in your workplace, who do you, in scholarship for us, we say, who do you quote, like who do you choose to work with, for instance? So many times because the world is constructed around men, and white men for that matter, it's so easy to just be, to keep thinking, oh, but there is this one who is an expert, who is that. So if you're going to be Pan-African feminist, we also need to be looking out all the time for our fellow women and African women, for opportunities, for everything that we do. If you need somebody to speak, and thank you very much, Seda, for inviting me. If you need somebody to think of anything, you have funding and you want to partner, look for other partners, you want to write a book with some people, let's carry our sisters. Let's be our sisters' keepers. In that way, we are able to create also a body of work, if we are writing, or a body of practitioners that are, and also another thing is we have to keep highlighting the great work that African feminists are doing. And that is what one of the things that Nalafem does so well. So if you have a meeting, if you have an expert, why should you look for some white man or African man, God knows where? And of course, African women may not have that maybe experience because of the many gender roles that they have to do. And not just African women, all women, because of the many gender roles that they have to carry, both reproductive, productive, and and communal. They always come with so much, so they're so burdened. So it's for you to go out of your way and say, despite XYZ, this is the kind of person I'm going to work with. So in terms of the workplace, those are practical things we can do. And lastly, as I think as Pan-African feminists, we need to organize. And I'm glad, Nalafem is one of the spaces that is organizing, and also And of course, with organizing, you need what Abdurrahman Tajuddin used to say. Let's organize. Let's not antagonize. Let's organize or something. So, and it's so creating spaces of these African women wherever you go. Many times, especially for those of us in very patriarchal spaces, it is usually very hard. It is difficult, but we always have to go out of our way in creating that space for women to feel safe. Sometimes it can just start with a little, even hangout or even just coffee, but it's very, very important. And it's one of the things I haven't done so well wherever we work with SEDA. But creating spaces for women, because it's only in where people create spaces and for women, safe spaces for that time to be together and to talk, that you find, oh, we have something in common. Oh, we can do this together. Oh, we can do this project together. Or we can do that, we can do this. So we need to create spaces and spaces for also mentoring the next generation of African feminists. So Nalafem has done a great job. What happens to the next generation, the 20-year-olds who are now in, say, university? How do we bring them on board? Or the younger, even the teens, so that we keep passing the baton. So creating those spaces is so important. There's a lot of spaces created online, but as you all know, online relationships are great, but you can only farm them up when you meet physically, organize, do events together. And I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wamai. And I think, from your intervention, your presentation, what comes out also very clearly and has been coming out clearly throughout the webinar that we've been hosting around accountability, is that accountability. And so now, even as we're talking about decolonization, starts with self, with organizations. And then for this conversation, like Leah, you mentioned as well, it really goes beyond just, funding to really just looking across the spectrum of the landscape of the space that we're working in. What are the structures that are in place? What are the processes that are in place that need to be decolonized? And thank you, Dr. Wamai, for unpacking for us in more detail what does decolonization and decolonialism actually mean. I'd like to now turn to our council member, Rosebell. And Rosebell, you've written extensively about decolonization and extensively also about what it means to be a Pan-African feminist, but also a Pan-African feminist organization. I have a question for you. And as Nala Council, you adopted a 5-year strategy that clearly states, and I'll quote from the strategy, and my colleague will share our strategy in the chat if anybody's interested to take a deeper look into it. But it states, while we are open to diverse resourcing, corporations and states are equally responsible for the oppression and discrimination against African women and girls. While they are the target of our advocacy efforts, we do not receive funding from those whose actions conflict with our values. We have clear boundaries to not receive funding from Zionist institutions or individuals and fossil fuel corporations, among others. So my question for you, Rosebell, a very bold statement and move by Nalafem to be purposeful and with the resourcing of the organization and who we partner with. So just coming back to accountability, how does such positioning serve the feminist decolonial agenda in the long term? Is my first question for you. And my second question, how do feminists listening to us now, some of them in the room, I think a lot of them who are watching live right now, who either have a seat at the table currently or perhaps are excluded from it, how and where do they start with a decolonial approach?
Thank you so much, Rim. Thank you, everyone. The speakers before, Dr. Wamai and Leah, thank you for the contributions. I think it's very important to first also pick up a little bit from, I think, things that have been said about the decolonization process. I was glad to hear Dr. Wamai really speak out on all these things and also point to African feminists that are doing this work to take us through the decolonization process and to think through it. And Dr. Slavia Tamale has been at the forefront forefront of decolonizing so many things, from the law on family law to sexualities and sexual expression in Africa. She's been at the forefront of all this work. And I wanted to share really a quote from her book on decolonization and Afrofeminism, where she reminds us that experiences of the oppressed are not mutually constitutive. They are not quantitative, but qualitative. So when people are asking you to do, you approach people, you want to do work, oftentimes funders are looking for quantity. But our experiences are not about quantity, they are qualitative. They are material conditions we've been forced into that we are trying to get out of. So therefore, as much as you want evidence, measure what constitutes as evidence, right? What constitutes as expertise is very, very narrow definitions of, oftentimes rooted in capitalist and patriarchal expectations and silencing experiences of the oppressed and who have come to the table to say, this is how I want to change my society. But somebody's already saying, like, I want you to change it like this within these parameters. And that is a very, very, for a long time, it's been a very big problem. But the problem is rooted in the fact that the origin of what we think of funding is, and recognizing the shift post-independence, post-flag independence, African countries, and then the onset of the Cold War, then our countries were also plunged into structural adjustment policies that have impoverished us for generations, where we saw very little demand for very little investment in public services at the request of IMF and the World Bank. And this process is still ongoing, actually. So we need to recognize, like, why actually decolonization is very important, because we are trying to organize, exist, and change our conditions within a very structure that was designed for us, but it's not liberatory. It's not going to liberate us, the neoliberal kind of structures that we're trying to organize within, right? So that's why we find, like, funding and the approaches of organizing become about a single thing, right? It's like someone is like, I'm all about sexual reproductive justice, and I don't know what, women voting in parliament are about, right? So you find that we are constantly reminded of what Audre Lorde said, like, we don't live single issue lives, and you cannot just pick and point and say, I'm going to fund this because this is the only thing that matters to me, without really connecting the dots of where African feminists, women, marginalized people, queer Africans, ethnically marginalized people, religious marginalized people find themselves, and how they found themselves in this place to begin with. So it's very, very important, these questions. We have to remember the context within which we are trying to organize, and to rethink that context every time you are trying to organize and trying to get into this funding system, and recognize that some of these things have failed us for generations, for the last 4 decades or 6 decades since most of our independence movement. So it's time to rethink, like, what has gone wrong, what has gone right, and then we try to build onto that. And that oftentimes you find that funding, for example, largely for a long time has left out what we call our harsh material conditions, what we find ourselves in, that we're trying to address. Also, behind that, there's a whole psychological and identity issues that have been so thrown at us by being thrown in a certain colonial construct called Kenya, called Uganda, called Senegal. It's very, very important to know that these are very important as trying to give someone water, because without addressing the critical identity and psychological impact of colonization, we can't. And usually we don't find funding for these kind of movements that are actually radical, the radical changes and shifts we need to have are not being supported. They are marginalized because they're trying to change the very system within which funding operates, right? So it's very, very important to pay attention to that and then say, what are the alternative funding models we can look that can actually fund very radical work that we need to do, which does not require us as feminists, as Pan-Africanists, to be, to be humble, to be towing the line, to be well-behaved, colonized person all the time, which is very, very much most of the funding that we are seeing, especially from wherever it might come from. These unspoken, there are conditionalities that you can go through and say, okay, the call should be, a call for application should include this and that, but there are unwritten norms and unwritten expectations because of the historic power imbalance in the racist capitalist system that we are working in. So how do we then jump out of that, work with that, but also where necessary, step outside it, So for me, it's very important to bring these conversations before I go to the question of Nalafem and how we arrive at those statements that we arrive on, and how do we creating equity? What does equity look like when the donor-funder relation is not a partnership? Even when they call it a partnership, it's still not a partnership. There's still so many conditionalities. There's still such expectations. And, right now, the relationship of philanthropies and all these donor agencies that you're seeing, now much more than ever, I think we've experienced in different conflicts in different situations. But right now, I hope you have seen the onslaught that has happened on Gaza, the genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people that is ongoing, which has been going on for 75 years. But this seems to be kind of the final assault that Israel wants to do in order to expel all Palestinians out of their land. And we are up to now still seeing people who are supposed to give us money, still on the fence, still, policing how we are going to talk about, the situation in Gaza and the fact that the situation in Gaza is unique in many ways, but also not so unique, because this could be us. This could be anybody who has been colonized, whose land someone can come and say, now you don't belong here. We see very many isolated situations like that in different parts of the world. We see the same recently. We see Australia, a whole parliament voting not to recognize indigenous people's land you found, people whom you found there, that you actually continue to derange yourself to be delusional that they don't exist, that their rights are not spatial. So it's very, very important to think at this critical moment in time, what then decolonization will look like. Even the little we've done, so we are thrown into the deep end of the world systems that are failing. For a long time, there were just bandages that we're trying to get money, shift resources, and the reality that these resources have been built off the backs of our ancestors. They've been stolen. Economies that are supposedly developed and rich have been developed on the backs, literally, human beings being taken to those economies, but also major resources, African women and African people being made to work, hard labor, taxation, failing our economies and disrupting our societies. That's where we find ourselves. So we can't escape that. It's not history, it is present. And oftentimes I think we've been brainwashed to think that, oh, it is the history, it is in the past. You guys got independence. What are you talking about? But which independence, right? What kind of funding can we talk about, for example, if you're in a French-speaking African country, which is under the colonial currency called the CFA, which takes away from your money every day and denies you of development, but you are supposed to get money from this funder, from this place. So I think that every room we go in, we must remind that we are not here to beg. We are here to agitate and say that we must abolish all the colonial imperial systems that are still remaining in Africa and beyond. Because without removing those imperial systems, we are going to still be filling out all these small applications for little money, when we really need to be putting our resources and energy and attention and, psychologically, mentally to developing ourselves. When you see often how much money is going into denial. Somebody saying Gaza is not colonized. Absolutely hogwash. Gaza is under siege. It is being colonized. Everybody knows that. If you haven't, you're under denial. So the Palestinian people have been colonized just like everywhere in the world for generations, unfortunately. It's one of the last remaining colonies alongside Western Sahara and other territories in the world. So we need to accept that we are going to continue. When we talk about decolonization, it's not like Dr. Omai said, dealing with only history. We are dealing with the present, that the systems have not gone, right? Why are we still begging after all these years if independence was independence, right? If exploitation ended in 1962 for me as a Ugandan, then why would we still be, where we are? We have to ask ourselves these hard questions, and we must carry them. They're heavy, but we are not here just to say, give me $50 and I go and give it to a woman to stop fetching water or stop sexual abuse. But there's sexual abuse, or even when you look at the current gendered violence we're experiencing in the continent in terms of attacks on queer African people across the continent, is very much rooted in coloniality and continuation of money moving into the worst of humanity, right? You are arming people to massacre others. You're arming people to spread hate. And that is what it is. And we don't see much money of the world moving into the decolonizing process, to the systems, to the thought that is happening, to the campaigns that people are talking about to educate and eradicate this kind of oftentimes ignorance and fight denial of our time. So we tend to think that these things are history, but they are not history. We are living here, and we are living examples. I think you saw Black Feminist Fund talking about currently Black organizers and many feminist organizations being threatened for their stand. For standing with Palestinian people and say end the siege, end apartheid, end colonization now. So we see that the threat is there, that funding has always been a tool and a threat to our organizing. So how do we then circumvent the times we are in, right? We see alternative fundings, not just in the West, but we lie at the cusp of history where for a long time the domination of Western empires is almost coming to an end. But what does that say for us, right? When you see the rise of the BRICS and all these organizations and multilateral, a multipolar world evolving for the first time in many, many decades, right? It might not be as rosy as some people want us to see, because we see alongside, we see people funding also anti-gender work, telling women that, we are all these forces uniting to say, this is a Western idea. But no, Western people brought us violence and colonization and taught us to police our bodies, taught us to, brought Victorian laws that tells me where my height of my skirt should be, brought laws that said that people who have different genders, who look not male or female, don't belong, that we should cast them away. These are not African belief systems. These were inculcated in us by the colonial empires. So we are still fighting an anti-colonial struggle all these years down the road. So it's very, very important that we can politicize every conversation that we can, including when we are looking for funding. I know that times are hard, that we will need to get money from here and there, but we have to sometimes remember that what are those the red lines. So if you're for all women and someone is killing trans people and supporting anti-trans hate, and you're getting money from them, what are you doing? So you're getting money from someone to undo the work you're trying to do. That is a no-go area. We should be able to make those hard, it's hard times, but we have to make even harder choices in these times. What does it mean for your funder? I saw a big funder, yesterday put out a statement. I won't mention them, but if you get money from them, that kind of staying on this line of playing tag that the place of Palestinians and the Israeli state is the same, that these are equal actors in war at each other. No, when 8,000 people have died, when 3,000 babies have been killed in 3 weeks, where else has this happened? And people are still debating the humanity of those babies. It is then when you are, even as an African, you might think this has nothing to do with you. You might even distance yourself from it, but it's going to hurt you. So it's very important to understand that our operations are interconnected as oppressed people, as colonized people, that even as we go into rooms and talk about decolonizing, the other day there was a whole conference on, I've been working on feminist foreign policy, and it's been very Western driven, like, oh, we are giving money to LGBTQ rights. We're giving money for sexual reproductive rights. So therefore that makes us feminists. But what makes you feminist if your state of Germany, instead of America, Canada, and France is still funding a massacre as it goes on? That is not feminist. We cannot allow that to be the definition of feminism, that the states in the West can hijack the very ideologies that have been really developed by marginalized people. And feminism is an ideology of marginalized people, not by people in power. So this idea that Western states are feminists need to die, because we have known it before, we have won before, but those who didn't think like that, even at this moment when we see when you see the dire situation in Palestine, in Sudan, and in Congo, and in many places, we realize that it's a fallacy, that you cannot be feminist and be Zionist. You cannot be a feminist and you be fascist. You cannot be a feminist and you continue to manufacture weapons of war that wipe out our populations, and you come to give us money to rebuild as you make more arms to come back and exterminate us. It does not work. So we need to really be very, very conscious of the politics and the structures within which that are shifting, but not shifting, but also what visions of the future can we lay down if we are still playing tag with these kind of forces. It's very, very important that we really make those hard choices. And the last one on the climate change and fossil fuels, it's very, very important. I think the talks are coming up in this month in Dubai. And we have seen like all these oil empires dominating and trying to usurp the resistance of indigenous peoples across the globe, and trying to put fossil fuels on top of everything, when we know that they are some of the worst that we have, that you might need them for now to expand and build an empire. But many people are paying the price somewhere, you know. So it's very, very important that when we talk about fossil fuels, who is investing in fossil fuels, and how as feminists can we navigate and know like this is not a go area, because people are dying literally from flooding, fires. You know, Libya, a whole city was sunk, you know, just in a few days of rainfall, and everywhere we see all these cyclones coming up, so all the time. So it's very, very important to remind ourselves that we are living in distraction times. Like villages, communities are being destroyed by climate change, forced displacement in the Sahel, with nowhere people to go, and they are crammed in refugee camps because of climate change. So those who are mainly responsible, then we cannot just get their money and say, oh, we are going to be nice to them, and not talk about the urgent need for them, for the rich countries, for the most polluting countries, from the countries that are the age of driving fossil fuels, to demand that they end the fossil fuel extraction, that we can all have a shared planet that is going to ensure our survival, not just the rich and those who have gained and elevated themselves and have gotten power through extermination and various means over centuries. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Rosebell, as always, very powerful, and also, for your expression of, the urgency of this process of decolonizing, and that as much as we speak about decolonizing funding, within this framework of us discussing accountability, we need to recognize that it is urgent, and us creating the processes, creating structures, creating and holding steadfast to our values is a matter of urgency. We have we are running a bit over time, but just acknowledging that I think we were prepared, that this is it's a very heavy topic, given what is happening around the world, not only in Gaza, but also in Congo, what we're seeing happening in DRC Congo. But we have a question from Visage Pillay in the chat, who speaks to, who's asking the question, how do we ensure that decolonization is ethical? And I think this question speaks towards us again as organizations. So as funding organizations, but also as Pan-African feminist organizations, how do we ensure that we do not proliferate structures, funding structures and processes that are colonial and essentially are unethical? So I'll direct that question to Leah. I know that you already shared with us some of the processes or what can be done, but I'll direct that question to you first. And then maybe Dr. Wamai, you can come in.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think that I tried to talk a little bit at the start about non-projectized and non-thematic funding. I think that's really, really crucial. I think almost all funding that we see in the international system, that comes from big multilaterals like the World Banks, all the way to some of the funding even that comes from women's funds and supposedly more progressive feminist funders, we still see that the vast majority of it comes with certain restrictions and certain ideas about what this funding needs to be spent on, with a lot of those decisions taken by people in offices in the global north with ideas about what development should look like and what activism should look like and what social justice looks like. And so I think the first thing that we can do is ask funders, whether you are a funder and it's about challenging people within your own organization and practices within your own organization, or whether you're doing advocacy work as like young feminists, holding funders accountable, I think it needs to be really calling for not just more funding for feminist organizations, but core, flexible, long-term funding that is not restricted to certain projects, that is not restricted to certain thematics, that acknowledges the diversity of work that's carried out by feminist movements globally, and that respects that and acknowledges as well that organizations, many of these organizations, I think Rosabelle mentioned this before, are operating on the front line. Some of this work is about survival. It's about, conditions that people have been placed into and then are trying to get themselves out of that. And I think when we have these excessive requirements coming from donors about demonstrating the impact, being able to constantly come back in these very short timeframes and say exactly what has been achieved, it's not realistic to the kind of work that's being done. And it maintains this kind of very colonial system of distrust and control that's so present within the aid and philanthropic system. So I think we really need to be an ethical approach to funding. Doesn't just require more and direct funding for these organizations, but it requires funding without these types of restrictions and funding that is flexible, that's long-term, that enables these organizations to set their own priorities and report on terms that make sense to them. Yeah, I think that it addresses the question.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Wamai, over to you.
You can call me Joki. So I totally agree with Leah and Rosabelle. In terms, I believe the question is about funding, decolonial funding, because it seems quite general. How do we ensure decolonization is ethical? I think decolonization, first, in its very conceptually what it is a very ethical thing to do, is the right thing to do, especially this decolonial agenda we are talking about, this questioning of power structures, that enduring power structures even after the colonial, because of the colonial legacy that we have between the global south and the global north. So questioning power structures, which is what now decolonization presently is about, first of all, is a very ethical thing. Whether it's done, and it's important, it's done by both people. So by the communities who are affected because they continue to do the advocacy, but also by those who formerly colonized others. And now, of course,
you'll find many people in Europe or in the US saying, oh no, this has to do, especially with, say, not just younger people, even older people. This has nothing to do with us. Those people who did bad things are long dead, or it's not us, or we're not in government. But you need to be an ally. I think that's we are talking about decolonial, I mean, accountability. You need to hold yourself to account. Yes, it's not maybe you who committed, like what we are saying right now in Kenya, crimes of colonialism, now that the British king and queen are visiting, but you must take responsibility of maybe people of your country. So, and each of us, I think we need to be taking responsibility. Sometimes, like for me, my ethnic group is Kikuyu here in Kenya, and they've really taken advantage of people over time, especially because the presidents have, I think there's been 2 presidents in power, and so it meant that they gave an undue advantage to my people over others. I take responsibility over that, right? So we need to let's take accountability and responsibility for things committed by people who I mean, by the kind of nations we come from. And so that way, that even the people who are questioning will feel at least there's a bit of empathy from your side. So if it's true, how do you make decolonization accountable in funding? I think it's in 3 ways. One, I say it again, it always has to start from you. First, decolonize your mind. You can do that through reading, through training, because once you hold yourself to account, you start seeing the things that you do that are so colonial, that are based on you taking advantage of your power structure, of your race, if you're white, of your class, if you're rich, of your sexual orientation, if you're a straight person, if you're an able-bodied person. So you must, if you are these ethnic groups that, have been running the show in many countries. So it's for you first taking your own accountability to yourself. And then after that, you're able to deal with others. So of course, in a funding situation, that's the first thing you do. Secondly, let the people you're working with be the ones identifying what I think they want to do. And I think Claire provided a very good framework that they're using with Mama Cash, reducing that a lot of funding. I mean, like, many of you probably have applied for EU funding. You wonder whether you will spend all your time now writing reports, or you will do the actual work. Why do donors do that? Because they don't trust people of the global south. And you compare that with the way they give funding to other global north countries. It's usually over like dinner, Oh yeah, it's okay, I'll do that for you. Just send me an email. Of course, there'll be accountability, but the kind of accountability required in the global south, it's based on that colonial suspicion, like these people, they cannot be trusted. And then over and above, changing those funding models that are just not, they're not really speaking to the people of the global south, is also dealing with the question of employment, which is really a big elephant in the room. Many of these donor organizations or even international aid organizations, they will always have people in the global south who are supposed to be experts, and they come from the global north, and they are paid so much money compared to their counterparts who they're working with at that local level. So you wonder, what are you doing in Nairobi? You're paid for school fees, you're paid in British schools and all these fancy places, and the commensurate person who is doing the same job has a salary like a third of that person. Nobody pays for their school fees for their kids. So why this unequal employment practices, especially in the aid sector? So decolonizing funding is also about funders have to stop funding people from the global north to go sit in the global south with so much privilege compared to the locals. So if it's a job and everybody is paid $3,000, that's how much you should be paid, whether you're from the global south, global north, and there are no benefits, or there are benefits for all of us. So those unfair practices in the employment sector is really about that colonial way of thinking. We are more important than these people. Our white lives matter more. So we are the ones who
have to be given more money because we have to live on the posh side of these African cities or in Latin America or in Asia, and they can live on the rough side of the city anyway. It's where they come from. So that kind of attitude. So it's based on racism, because coloniality is really about racism. So that's another thing. So employment practices, and eventually when we do the projects, I think the projects most of the time, if they're based on the local agenda, then that should be what is emphasized on. The people at the local level, the funding should come to the people at the local level. I sit in a board, and that's one of the conversations we've been having. Why are you funding people at the national level? Why don't you fund the community to do the work? And of course, the people who work there, and rightly so, they're saying, but the taxpayers want to see every cent accounted for. Will the people at the local level be able to account for our money? That's all you need to do, is invest in training. Invest in training those people and develop their capacities, so that you don't need to keep flying all these people from the West to be acting like, we are here to look after our money. Eventually, one of the things we need to do is also local philanthropies. I know we keep saying in Africa we have black tax, so everybody's paying for 10 people school fees, so we can't be giving more money to others. But there are lots of people, individuals with lots of money. I think we even forget about those individuals who are high net worth, even the ordinary us. I think it's time we started committing money to supporting local NGOs. And I do that for like two of my favorite women's organizations. I try and give, even though it's not a lot of money, a little money every year, to just say, this is my contribution to the great work you're doing. If we have 100 people doing that kind of thing, maybe things can start changing. So let's start rethinking also our funding models. As feminists also, let's start committing to Pan-African organizations. Yeah, and so I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Omai. And on that note, I'll put in the chat just so we can collectively harvest this. Our chat has been very active today, so thank you everybody who's logged in via Zoom. So the question is, what innovations or concrete examples or case studies of effective accountability models can you share with us? So I'll leave that open in the chat for it as we start wrapping up for anybody in the audience to share. And I leave that question open to you, Leah, Rosebell, and Joki. It's very difficult for me to tell you, Joki, not Dr. Omai, but what innovations?
Yeah.
What innovations can you share, or case studies around this, this discussion that we've had today? Do any come to your mind? And we can just, popcorn style, whoever would like to share can unmute.
So I've spoken so much, so I'll let Rosebell speak.
But I'm here laughing, Joki. You haven't spoken so much. I think it's very, very important to notice the trends that are happening on the continent. And definitely we need to stop looking at homogenization of like a people, and understand that the fastest growing, some of the fastest growing economies in the region, and we have seen it in many ways, even if it's on different skills, how people come together. Mutual aid has always been. So I think that we have to stop thinking of like philanthropy in a Western sense too. Like, how do you decolonize that idea of philanthropy, right? The fact that mutual aid is part of our DNA, like we show up and we actually fund things. Sometimes things that you might not think have like really material value, like investment, but it's very important to use those connections and networks which have sustained our countries. Right now, if you go to my village or any village, there are very many women's groups that have sustained, save money, sustain systems, send kids to school, more than any investment from a public sector. Those women save every penny they can get, and they support each other to get their children through school, make sure that they are buried peacefully and in dignity. These are very important things that we have to build on, and not think that money is always the big money bulk, even when the most marginalized are organizing and using the resources and trying to multiply their resources together to actually make an impact. So it's very important. We've seen a couple of models of where foundations and donors have then created these kind of huge institutions nationally, right? Trying to say, okay, we are localizing, so we are going to get another big institution at the national level, which is going to take care of everybody. And in many ways, I must say, has been also very problematic, because you're choosing very classed people, and oftentimes, if it is on general human rights, democracy, it will be men, right? And women working on those issues will not be visible. That's why every time you switch on your TV, who's talking about democracy? It's men. Unless women are there to talk about women's share of democracy. And who then, when it comes to certain women's rights, the people dominating the money and managing these resource funds that have been brought to the national level are most like, if they're about women's organizing, will be very much women, heterosexual women, classed heterosexual women, who then are really rich, and there have been problems around accountability, how they account for these resources to the people who are supposed to need these resources. So we have to be very, very, careful in terms of kind of new hegemonies that then are exported into our ecosystems, that you have very many, no matter where you go, you have very many, heterosexual women running big funds on behalf of donors in different countries, and they become gods. So other social movements have to really beg and be in the books, in the good books of this person. Why wouldn't you give the money directly to the queer movement in Uganda? Why do they need to go through a whole system of another organization which does not even agitate for their rights, right? And yet they have to go through them. Why would you give money for sex workers through an organization that doesn't even recognize, actively sex workers movement, the fact that sex work is work and it should be decriminalized? They are not even visible on that issue, but they are supposed to integrate somehow sex workers into their work, and they're getting money, big money, on behalf of these movements. In the queer movement, we've seen a lot of heterosexual men leading visibility of queer movements, but when there are queer people already risking their lives to actually be out and show face and agitate for their politics. So we need to really break down what is happening also on the national level, not just our countries, like the imbalance of the global south, global north, western or eastern. It's very, very important also know how then those systems have been currently introduced slowly to create an imbalance on who then gets money, and then which issue gets visibility at any time.
Yep. Thank you so much, Rosebell. So I'd like us to, as we're wrapping up now, invite both Leah, Rosebell, and Joki, if you could just complete the sentence. I am Nala because. So over to you, Leah. I am Nala because.
I have to go first. Okay. I am Nala because I choose, like, today and every day to be in movement with feminist activists from around the world, and learn from the incredible work they're doing to advance social, gender, racial justice.
Thank you. Joki?
I am Nala because I choose to fight injustice, especially as a feminist and a Pan-Africanist, every day.
Thank you. Rosebell, I am Nala because.
I'm Nala because I'm already Nala, but let's say for this occasion that I am Nala because every day I really labor to look within me, to look at what injustices am I upholding as a person, and then work towards actually eliminating those within my being. And then that's the only way I can show up to be in solidarity with others.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our great panel for sharing such valuable insights with us today and really holding this space for such an important and heavy topic. Thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope that our discussion today has contributed to promoting the importance of accountability and accountability that is decolonial. Please join us in our next webinar on December 1st. Our topic will be innovating in accountability. Feel free, as always, to reach out to us on the email facilitator@nalafem.org to suggest speakers you would like us to invite for the next webinar, or simply to share your feedback. Follow us again on social media and continue to use the hashtag Nalafem Accountability and CSW68. We will meet every first Friday of the month as always, and can't wait to see you next month. Have a great weekend, everybody. Stay safe.